One thing our ancestors did not need to learn is how to breathe properly. Unfortunately, in our modern society, there are so many things that have changed in such a short amount of time that has really negatively affected our breathing. These are things that a lot of our ancestors did not deal with. These are things like chronic stress, living a sedentary lifestyle, or basically being lazy. Also eating unhealthy diets, like more processed foods. I mean, how many people do you know that regularly eat fast food? Because I know a ton. And also, believe it or not, living in a clean and safe home will also negatively affect our breathing. Now, some of these things you can't even avoid. I mean, how can you avoid living in your house? But some of these things you can change. Our ancestors, on the other hand, were very different than us. They had to hunt for their food. So they were always physically active, no matter what. Every day was moving. And also, they ate more natural foods. I mean, they had no processed foods back then. There was no McDonald's, no KFC. Those weren't even options. Now compare a hunter-gatherer back in the day to an average person now with this dad bod, eating potato chips, sitting on the couch, or slouched over on their office desk. The result from all these changes is that a lot of us have become chronic overbreathers, or we're breathing way more than our body physically needs. And this will lead to a whole list of negative effects to our body. Just like you can be eating too much or drinking too much water, you can also be breathing too much air. And there's a lot of cases of unexplainable things that can happen to your body by simply breathing too much. And these are things like being out of shape, or having asthma, or having anxiety, and also chronically being tired, having insomnia, having heart problems, and even obesity. So one thing that happens when you breathe too much is you have reduced blood flow. So the blood that's flowing in your body will actually go down, and actually by quite a bit. If you start to overbreathe or start to hyperventilate and breathe really quickly for just 2 minutes, and maybe even less than that, you can start to feel really dizzy and really lightheaded, and you're gonna get less blood flowing to different organs, like even your brain. So one interesting thing that a guy named Dr. Daniel Gibbs found, and this was posted in the American Journal of Psychiatry, he found that when people breathe too much, that their blood vessels will actually constrict. And it can actually constrict by as much as 50% in some people. Now, if you remember from geometry, that means that your blood flow will reduce to only a quarter of what it was before. Now, you might be wondering, how could it reduce to a quarter if it shrunk by half? Well, there's an interesting equation called pi r squared. So when you shrink that radius by 50%, then you have to square that to see how much actual blood flow is being reduced. So these people's blood flow, by simply breathing too much, their blood flow went down to a quarter of what it could be. Now that can have disastrous effects on our entire body. But the main effect this is gonna have is you're gonna have less oxygen. And it's not because you're not breathing enough oxygen in the air. It's gonna be because you're not having enough oxygen being carried around your body. And this is why people who breathe too much, they are having so many issues, like having chronically being tired, or chronically having anxiety, or other issues. And this is a big problem for people who regularly breathe through their mouth, because people who breathe through their mouth will generally breathe way too excessively compared to people who generally breathe through their nose. And this is also the reason why people who breathe through their mouth, especially when sleeping, they wake up and they never feel fully rested. No matter how many hours of sleep they get, they still wake up tired, they wake up groggy. It takes them a few hours to get back into the zone of actually being awake and being alert. And they also wake up with a dry mouth and dry throat and all the other negative effects of mouth breathing. There are many studies that show that mouth breathers, whether you're awake or whether you're asleep, it's going to negatively affect you in so many ways. And it all comes down to breathing too much. So it can actually reduce people's concentration, people's focus goes down. Also, their productivity goes down. They also generally are in worse moods overall. Like, when people are hangry, they're like that all the time. And mouth breathers also get tired faster than people who are nose breathers. Now, if you look back at all the information, it makes sense, right? Because when you're chronically overbreathing and you're getting this reduced blood flow and this reduced amount of oxygen delivered all over your body, then obviously it's going to affect your body. And it would make sense why it affects pretty much every system, whether it's affecting your mood and your cognition or affecting how tired you are. And this is the same reason why professions that involve a lot of talking, people generally feel really tired after work. So people like teachers or salesmen or podcasters, they generally feel really tired after, because when you're talking, your breathing also increases and you're again over breathing. And the difference with overbreathing when you're talking too much versus overbreathing when you're exercising is when you're working out, that's a justified need to breathe more because your body needs more oxygen to produce more energy for your workout. But when you're talking in front of a classroom or when I'm doing a podcast and I'm talking so much, my body does not need that extra oxygen. There's no justification for it because I don't need that extra energy. But this is why people who talk too much, they feel really tired after because it changes their blood gases and it ends up reducing the amount of oxygen that's being delivered to all of your cells. It's basically like hyperventilating for a long period of time and then seeing how you feel after. This is why for a lot of people, focusing on reducing the amount of breathing that they're doing throughout the day is going to help them so much. So the main ways to do that is to only use your nose to breathe. So this is especially true when you're not working out, but also when you're sleeping. So a way to do that is actually to simply tape your mouth shut when you're sleeping. And you can get literally any tape on Amazon. I recently got one that's called a 3M micropore paper tape. This is basically a surgeon's tape, and it's very safe for the skin, and it's very easy to use. You just rip a piece off and put it over your lips. You don't need to get any of those fancy tapes out there. Simply using a surgical tape like this will get the job done and it's way cheaper. But if you only use your nose and you reduce the amount of breathing that you're doing, it's actually gonna increase the amount of oxygen that's going to all of your cells. And it may sound counterintuitive because when you're short of oxygen and short of oxygen going to your cells, it would make sense to take big gulps of air. But what you're doing is you're actually getting rid of a molecule called CO2. The CO2 is basically that waste product that you breathe out. But when you breathe too quickly and you breathe too much, you're expelling too much of that CO2. Now, CO2 has a lot of benefits for our body. Our CO2 is basically what controls our blood pH, or how acidic our blood is. So our blood pH has to stay between a level of 7.35 to 7.45. That number is very important because if it gets too high or if it gets too low, then we can actually die. So our body's going to do everything it possibly can to retain this pH, or our blood acidity. But the problem is if we lose too much of our CO2, then our body cannot control our blood pH as much. And that's why it has to resort to other measures to try to force our pH to stay the same. And that's why everything starts to shrink. That's why our breathing tubes start to shrink. That's why our blood vessels start to shrink. And in turn, our oxygen carrying capacity goes lower and we get less oxygen to our cells. So it's not just about one thing. You have to make sure everything, our whole body, stays in homeostasis. And the best way to make sure you have enough CO2 is to try reducing the volume of air that you're breathing. One of the biggest mistakes people make when they start feeling out of breath is they start taking these big gulps of air through their mouth. But the problem is, this is not fixing the problem. It's actually making the problem worse. It would be better to start slowing your breathing down and to start using your nose to breathe whenever